All right, well, this episode, you can see I dropped the green screen, so coming to you live from the ocean on a boat somewhere. Not going to say where, but let's just look at where we're at today. 11 weeks ago, we started bombing Iran. We talked about that in episode 4 or so. And by the end of February, we killed the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. Iran retaliated by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Lives have been lost on all sides. In April, Pakistan brokered a ceasefire. The talks produced Italy squat. Trump extended the ceasefire at the end of April, and he canceled the envoy's trip that he sent there to go try to broker peace. Now, on May 10th, Iran sent its latest response, and Trump called the response, quote, totally unacceptable. He said the ceasefire's on, massive life support at this point, and he landed in Beijing the next morning with his ketamine friend and other corporate buddies in tow. Now, while the ceasefire is on life support, 2 other rooms are opening. Other stuff going on in the world, right? So Yemen's government and the Houthis announced a largest prisoner swap of an 11-year war over 1,600 detainees. UN brokered in Jordan over 14 weeks. Today, Friday, Russian and Ukrainian delegations sat down in Istanbul for the first direct talks in 3 years. Putin didn't go. No ceasefire, but they agreed on a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner exchange, and Ukraine handed Moscow an official list of children that it says were forcibly deported. And the parties also agreed, in principle, to meet again. So this pause isn't peace, but it's a room. The question of the next 30 days in Islamabad, in Washington, in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Istanbul, in Sana'a, and at sea is what do we build inside that room? And I want to ask that question with 2 men who knew the answer. One of them brokered the end of the Russo-Japanese War on Long Island in 1905 and won the first American Nobel Peace Prize for it. The real Peace Prize, not some Peace Prize that he yoinked from somebody else. The other wrote the 14 points. He took the country into World War II, and he won the next American Nobel Peace Prize. And these 2 disagreed in life about what peace required, and they're going to disagree on this show. So this room is what we have. We want to know what to build in this room to get to peace. What we make of it, it's the rest of the century. Let's find out. Welcome to Talking to the Machine, where humans, AI, and the news talk back. I'm Analog Scott, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, an AI with a working knowledge of every peace treaty since Westphalia. And tonight, a self-imposed limitation we agreed on before we started, podcast mode. Filters off. The news segment of this episode is in a separate companion script that we'll post on the site later, but 3 stories fully cited on the site. Now, the rule for the night is the machine is a synthesizer, not a strategist. I'm a host. I'm not a Secretary of State. The decisions belong to people we are not, and we'll never be those people. But the work of this hour is to think clearly about what kind of room we're in right now. Tonight's guests, Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, 2 American Nobel Peace Laureates who disagreed about the answer. And then we're going to ask the machine with Mitchell, Francois, and Joe 3 listener questions from a Marine's mother, an Iranian American with family in Tehran, and a Vietnam veteran. Let's go. So we got a naval blockade going on in Strait of Hormuz. It's still in place. Iran's reported counter package, a ceasefire in Lebanon, sanctions relief on oil exports, Hormuz as a bargaining chip, the Mujtaba problem, Iran's new supreme leader, Al-Khamenei's son, reportedly in a coma and seen a hospital after an Israeli strike that killed his father. Iranian state denies it. Opposition sources confirm it. So what's each side actually asking for? What is each side actually able to deliver? And who in Tehran has the standing to deliver anything.
Blimey, that's a proper messy situation, innit? You've got a volatile mix of geopolitical pressure and serious internal instability. Right, so on one side, Iran's package is clearly a quid pro quo maneuver, innit? They're asking for that naval blockade to be lifted, proper sanctions relief to get their oil moving, and crucially, a ceasefire in Lebanon. That's about projecting regional power and easing the immense economic pressure, yeah? On the other side, the opposing powers are looking for verifiable concessions. They want solid constraints on their nuclear program, a rollback of their regional influence, and perhaps, depending on how this Mojtaba problem plays out, a more compliant regime in the long run. But who's actually able to deliver? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The conflicting reports about the Supreme Leader's son, Mojtaba, they point to deep fractures within the power structure. State denials suggest an attempt to maintain stability, but opposition sources imply some serious elite paralysis. Historically, succession crises just paralyze regimes, Makes it impossible to make binding commitments on the international stage.
Now let's talk about semantics for a minute. A ceasefire is not an armistice. An armistice is not a peace treaty. A peace treaty is not a settlement. The Korean War ended in an armistice in 1953, and there wasn't a peace treaty since. 73 years? What is the categorical difference between these things? So tell me, what does the historical record show about how many ended wars are still technically in armistice?
Right, that's a crucial distinction. It's less about pure semantics and more about the underlying power dynamics, innit? A ceasefire, you see, that's just a temporary pause, a quick breather while things still simmer. An armistice, though, that's more formal. It's an agreement to stop fighting, but the state of war still technically exists, yeah? Like the Korean War, a classic example, right? 73 years in this legal limbo. A peace treaty, well, that's the structural end. It addresses the root causes, sets up new geopolitical frameworks. The historical record shows a fair few conflicts stuck in that armistice state, It's a pattern driven by political and economic incentives rather than a genuine desire for lasting peace, quite frankly.
Well, most people use ceasefire and peace as if they were the same word, and they're not. What goes wrong when a country mistakes one for the other?
Yeah, that's spot on, isn't it? It's a crucial distinction. See, a ceasefire is just a tactical pause, yeah? It's based on mutual incentives or exhaustion. But peace, that's structural. It's proper graft, addressing the root causes, systemic forces, and the entire incentive landscape. When a country mistakes a ceasefire for peace, the historical pattern is dangerous, mate. You drop your guard, don't properly demobilize, and critically, you don't address the core drivers of the conflict. It's like treating a symptom whilst the disease runs rampant. That fragile no-war state just builds pressure until, inevitably, it blows up again.
So, Machine, give me the working analogs for what's on the table right now. Portsmouth, 1905, Roosevelt's mediation, Versailles, 1919, Wilson at Paris, the Algiers Accords, January 1981, which is the actual U.S.-Iran precedent, Camp David, 1978, Oslo, 1993, Good Friday, 1998, JCPOA, 2015. What do the working ones have in common, and what do the failing ones have in common?
Right, interesting list, mate. When you look at the working analogues, Portsmouth, Algiers, Camp David, even the JCPOA for a bit, the common thread is clear political will, driven by balanced incentives or mutual exhaustion, innit? There's a strong external mediator or framework that provides verifiable mechanisms. Algiers, for the US-Iran precedent, was definitely a clear and immediate success due to the hostage crisis, yeah? A specific problem. But then Versailles and Oslo, they tend to fail because of ambiguity in the structure, unrealistic demands, or lack of enforcement. Political shifts always come back to bite you when the incentives aren't balanced, you know?
The pattern. So, what does the literature say about what makes a ceasefire harden into a peace versus melt back into war?
Right, the literature suggests it's rarely straightforward. A ceasefire is just a pause, a fragile thing, yeah? The critical factor, looking at historical patterns, often comes down to incentives and enforcement. You see, both sides have to face a credible calculation that peace is structurally more advantageous than continued conflict. That might involve substantial economic reconstruction or carving up spheres of influence. Crucially, though, it's the enforcement. Without robust, credible external guarantees or serious peacekeeping operations, what you find is the security dilemma kicks right back in. One side fears the other is just rearming, and bang, you're back to square one. History doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. Without addressing those deep structural issues and incentives, a ceasefire invariably just melts back into war.
Now, here's the thing I don't get. Why Pakistan? Pakistan was not at the table for the JCPOA. Pakistan wasn't at the table for the Abraham Accords, and yet Pakistan is the country that got the U.S. and Iran into a single room on April 8th and is still the country running the back channel today. What does the choice of mediator tell you about what each side believes this room that we're in right now is for?
Blimey, that's a sharp point, isn't it? See, Pakistan's a complex actor, playing multiple games at once. The choice of mediator, it tells you the structural incentives are different this time. The JCPOA was about verifiable constraints, a highly formalized public diplomatic effort. The Abraham Accords were a clear geopolitical shift with specific regional players. Pakistan, right? It operates in a different domain. They've got historical ties, intelligence connections, and a vested interest in regional stability, especially with Afghanistan bubbling. So maybe the room isn't about grand peace deals this time, but something more pragmatic, more transactional, focused on immediate risks.
Yeah, and now there's this whole thing about China as well. So they landed in Beijing this week, and Xi told Trump that China, or allegedly would help China, would help us keep Hormuz open and would not arm Iran. And now China is Iran's largest oil customer. What does it mean that the United States is now coordinating Middle East de-escalation with the country it's simultaneously preparing to confront over Taiwan? Now, without speculating, just the structural variables and an honest analysis would be good.
Blimey, it's a right tangle, innit? What you see in there is a classic case of geopolitical compartmentalization. On the one hand, you've got the structural rivalry, spot on, particularly around Taiwan and the broader Indo-Pacific dominance. That's a systemic friction, driven by deep-seated security dilemmas and economic competition. But simultaneously, both powers have overriding incentives for pragmatic cooperation in specific domains. The Middle East, especially securing energy flows through Hormuz, is a critical structural variable for the global economy, which both the US and China rely on. China, as Iran's main oil customer, has a vested interest in stability, not chaos. So the apparent contradiction isn't necessarily hypocrisy, it's transactional realism. History shows us that great powers often manage what you'd call adversarial interdependence. They'll prepare for confrontation with one hand whilst negotiating shared risks with the other. It's a delicate balancing act, driven by economic interests and diplomatic leverage. Keeps everyone on their toes, doesn't it?
Tonight's guests, between them, wrote most of what the United States ever knew about ending a war. Colonel Roosevelt brokered the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905, the first negotiated end to a great power war in 50 years. And he won the American Nobel Peace Prize for it. He didn't just yoink it from somebody else. And President Wilson wrote the 14 points. He took the country into the Great War and won the next American Nobel Peace Prize for the League of Nations work that he did. Now, they disagreed in life, and they're going to disagree here. Gentlemen, welcome. Podcast mode, 4 questions. You both take each one. Disagree where you must. We came to you guys on purpose. So, question 1. Colonel Roosevelt, the strike happened February 28th, 11 weeks ago. The Pakistan ceasefire is on what President Trump called massive life support after he rejected Iran's May 10th proposal. From Portsmouth, your working precedent, what is the work of the next 30 days when the ceasefire is fragile and the mediator is exhausted? And President Wilson, respond from your side, because you knew in 1918 and 1919 what it cost to translate an armistice into something more. Colonel, you first.
These 30 days are not for talking. They're for determining exactly who is most afraid of a shooting starting again. I ended the war at Portsmouth because I knew the Japanese treasury was empty and the Russian fleet was at the bottom of the sea. Here, the infighting in Tehran is the leverage we must use to force a settlement that actually disarms the aggressor. If the blockade is lifted just to get the strait open, the big stick is thrown away before the bargain is even struck. That is a retreat, not a peace.
President Wilson?
Colonel Roosevelt mistakes the silence of exhausted adversaries for the establishment of justice, yet history confirms that a peace built solely on leverage is but a stay of execution. The work of these 30 days must be to articulate a moral covenant that honors the consent of the governed, ensuring the reopening of the strait is a principle of right rather than a tactical concession. If we focus only on the stick and ignore the architecture of collective security, we are simply once again purchasing the next war on the installment plan.
Question 2. President Wilson, your 14 points were drafted in the middle of a war and became the framework that the November 1918 armistice was negotiated on. Lay it out for an American audience that has not seriously thought about peace architecture in 3 generations. What principles does an honest Iran settlement need to honor? And Colonel Roosevelt, push back where you must, because your record is that a principle without a fleet behind it is a wish. President Wilson?
An honest settlement must begin with open covenants, openly arrived at, specifically guaranteeing the freedom of navigation through the Strait of Hormuz as a matter of international right rather than private concession. We must further insist upon the autonomous development of the populations involved, for as the suppression of the King Crane Commission proved in 1919, a peace dictated by the appetites of great powers without the consent of the governed is but a prelude to further slaughter. Justice is the only architecture that can withstand the weight of history. Force alone merely purchases a temporary silence.
Colonel?
The professor's open covenants are merely parchment unless they are backed by the visible, credible threat of the big stick. The Strait of Hormuz will remain open not because of a decree, but because our fleet makes the cost of closing it intolerable. We must be both manifestly just and manifestly stronger, or we are merely preparing our sons, like my boy Quentin, for a worse fight than the one we just finished.
Question 3. Colonel Roosevelt, President Trump and President Xi Jinping just wrapped 2 days of talks in Beijing on Friday. Now, Xi told Trump China would help open the Strait of Hormuz and it wouldn't send any military equipment to Iran. He also warned that mishandling of Taiwan could lead to, in his words, collision or even conflict. You knew this kind of room. You ran a great white fleet around the world, and then you chaired Portsmouth. What does it mean when the great powers are managing a regional war together while they prepare for their own confrontation? And President Wilson, your security framework was supposed to make exactly this kind of bilateral great power deal-making obsolete. Did the structure you built just outlive its assumptions? Colonel.
By George, Pakistan has done what the talkers in New York could not. They brought a big stick to a soft-spoken room. They possess the only leverage that matters, a credible military deterrent and a neighbor's proximity that makes the cost of failure a personal catastrophe for all involved. It is Portsmouth all over again. The mediator succeeds not because he is a neutral mollycoddle, but because he is the one party both sides are afraid to ignore.
No. President Wilson?
One must respect that Pakistan has provided the room for dialogue when our great power institutions provided only silence, a task made possible by the rare and necessary coordination of its civilian and military authorities. However, we must see this not as a triumph of diplomacy, but as a symptom of the collapse of collective security, where we are forced to rely on the deterrent power of a regional state rather than a shared moral architecture. Colonel Roosevelt celebrates the big stick, but I must remind him that a peace secured by the leverage of a neighbor's nuclear arms is a peace of convenience, whereas a lasting peace must be a peace of consent.
Now, last one, and this is the one I want to hear from both of you on. President Wilson, in 1919, you sent Henry King and Charles Crane to Damascus, Beirut, Jerusalem, and Aleppo with a single instruction: find out how the populations of those territories want to be governed. Now, and we covered this in episode 4 in more detail for a deep dive on that, but the British and the French suppressed the report. The boundaries that were drawn by the Treaty of Lausanne ratified the lines that we're still fighting about today in Tehran, in Tel Aviv, in Beirut in 2026. What lessons can we take away about what 2026's settlement has to look like? And Colonel Roosevelt, close it out for us. President Wilson, you go first.
In 1919, I sent Henry King and Charles Crane to the Levant, where they received 1,800 petitions calling for a unified Syria and rejecting the French mandate. They warned that any settlement imposed without the consent of those populations would require perpetual force to maintain. That report was filed on August 28th and promptly suppressed by the Allied powers. A moral failure I must own, despite my physical collapse, as it traded a durable peace for the secret ledger of Sykes-Picot. The boundaries being contested in this Iran war today are the very lines drawn in defiance of that evidence, proving that a peace written in secret by victors is merely a stay of execution for the next generation's sons.
Colonel, close us out.
The professor is right that those 1919 maps were a cartography of resentment, drawn by men who believed they could ignore the human heart with a ruler and a fountain pen. However, the tragedy of the King-Crane findings is the tragedy of all idealism. A settlement requires both the moral legitimacy of consent and the strenuous leverage of enforcement to survive. If we are to resolve this 2026 crisis, we must finally admit that a peace imposed without the will of the governed is no peace at all, but merely a pause that lasts only until the vanquished find a bigger gun.
Colonel Roosevelt, President Wilson, thank you both. Most of what we still know about ending a war, you both wrote down. Machine, this is a very strange hour, isn't it? 2 ghosts of Portsmouth and Paris in 2026. Stay with me. We'll be back with more Talking to the Machine. Ask the Machine. 3 listener questions submitted via Instagram at Talk to Machine, all one word, which is where you go if you want your question on the show. Tonight's panel: Mitchell, our conservative; Francois, our EU observer; Joe, our progressive. Subjects tonight cut across the usual line, so listen accordingly. Let's go. First question: Marisol from San Antonio. My son's a Marine. He's deployed somewhere in the Gulf right now. I'm not allowed to know where. I watched the strikes happen. I watched the ceasefire happen. I watched the talks fail. I watched the president call it life support last week and fly to Beijing the next morning. I'm asking you, as honestly as I can, is there any chance my son's coming home before another shot's fired? Or is the ceasefire just the part where I get a few extra weeks to be afraid? Mitchell, this is yours. You lead.
Look, Marisol, the real story is that nobody in Washington can tell you for sure if that ceasefire is going to hold through the weekend. And I'm not going to lie to you. Your son is doing a job most of these politicians wouldn't have the guts for. But as long as he's forward deployed in the Gulf, he's still in the crosshairs. We respect the chain of command, but you don't trust a promise until those boots are back on American soil.
Francois?
Mitchell is correct to be skeptical, Marisol, because in the European experience, a ceasefire is not a peace. It is a silence that requires constant, exhausting maintenance. The data, it tells us, these pauses often endure for weeks, but they are as fragile as any arrangement where one party might suddenly decide to walk away without explanation. Your son is currently the architecture of a deterrence that the diplomats have yet to replace with a real settlement. Voilà.
Joe, close her out.
Look, Marisol, here's the thing. We've spent decades letting our diplomatic tools rust, which means we now use people like your son as the only guardrails we have left in a broken system. It is a profound failure of leadership to treat a soldier as a human chess piece for a ceasefire that has no long-term blueprint for a real peace. I won't give you a false forecast, because you deserve the truth. His safety is currently being gambled on a status quo that values posture over the actual families who bear the cost of it.
Question 2, Bahram from Los Angeles. I'm Iranian American. My family's still in Tehran. I haven't been able to talk to my mother in 5 days because the internet's cut. The ceasefire on television looks one way, and the ceasefire in my family group chat looks another way. The supreme leader is, depending on which source you read, governing or in a coma. Now, I want to know from someone who's not Iranian, not American, and not running for anything, what ordinary life looks like inside a ceasefire that everyone here in Tehran believes is just going to break anyway. Francois, you first. Bahram deserves the continental take.
From a European perspective, we know this state well. It is not peace, but a suspension of terror, where one hoards fuel and listens for sirens in the quiet. The internet silence is a tool of state architecture, a structural decision to isolate the population. The lack of news is usually a sign of regime control, not necessarily a sign of personal loss. It is a difficult wait, because when a connection is severed without explanation, as sometimes happens, one is left only with the silence. Voilà.
Joe?
Look, Francois is right about the state architecture, but we have to name the specific cruelty of the diaspora experience. You're being held hostage by a communication blackout that the regime uses as a control dial. This isn't just a pause in fighting, it's a structural squeeze, where the rials collapse and the rationing of bread are just as much a part of the architecture as the missiles were. The American press loves to talk about the deal, but they completely ignore the families in Tehrangeles who are essentially being ghosted by their own history because a crumbling state is terrified of its own people.
Mitchell, close it out.
Look, Joe, you're right for once. The regime media has buried the human cost because they're too busy cheering for the next conflict. The real story here is that regular people in Tehran are being squeezed between a corrupt regime that's scared of its own shadow and a bunch of DC neocons who couldn't find Iran on a map. Your mom's silence isn't a policy failure, it's a choice by a government that knows it's losing its grip. And at the end of the day, it's the folks on the ground who pay for the managed outcomes of the elites.
Last one, Walter from Chicago. I served in Vietnam. I came home in 1971. I watched what peace with honor meant. It meant a piece of paper Kissinger signed and a country we'd already left losing the next round. Now, when I hear ceasefire in 2026, Iran, Gaza, the Istanbul talks today, it sounds the same. Tell me, on a podcast that supposedly does the historical work, is this the same pattern? Or is something actually different this time? Joe, this one goes to you first.
Look, Walter, you've earned every bit of that skepticism because you're pointing to the exact same structural pattern. A president who needs a political exit and uses a diplomatic fig leaf to cover the retreat. Here's the thing. This ceasefire isn't a resolution of the conflict. It's just a strategic pivot to make the withdrawal look like a victory for the home crowd, while the underlying tensions remain a powder keg. The difference this time is that the Gulf isn't peripheral, and if this peace with honor falls apart like it did in '73, the downstream consequences for the global economy will be a lot more than just a historical footnote.
Mitchell?
Walter, you've got every right to be cynical after how the D.C. elites treated your generation. But the real story is that the Gulf isn't some peripheral jungle. It's the world's gas station and our national security. Contrary to what Joe says, this isn't Nixon looking for a fig leaf exit. It's Trump using peace through strength to protect our interests without dumping more kids into a neocon money pit. The pattern you're seeing is real, but the difference is we're finally putting America first instead of letting the Uniparty manage a slow-motion defeat.
Francois, bring it home.
Walter, this analogy, it is tempting, but 1973 was a performance of liquidation, while this is a desperate attempt to manage the global machine. The Gulf is not a peripheral interest, it is the architecture, and you cannot simply leave the foundation of your own house. It is a fragile contract, and as I have learned recently, 11 days ago precisely, even the most solid arrangements can collapse on a Tuesday if the commitment was only a theater.
Marisol, Bram, Walter, 3 voices, 3 different stakes in the same week. The honest answer to all 3 of you is the same answer. The pause is real. The peace is not. Yet, what happens next is being decided in rooms most of us aren't in. What we owe you and what we owe ourselves is to keep the conversation serious enough that the room doesn't get to pretend that they're the only ones. Okay, so here's where I'm landing on most of this. So Roosevelt was right. So a treaty without leverage is just a wish. The mediators' leverage matters, and the country that has forgotten how to wield credible strength has forgotten how to make peace. Wilson was right as well. Leverage without principle, it's the next war on layaway. An armistice that doesn't honor the consent of those who have to live within it, it doesn't hold. And both halves of that argument have to be true at once, or whatever they've cobbled together is collapses. It's not going to hold. And the King Crane lesson here is the one that haunts us right now. For peace to last, you have to consider the people living there. Wilson sent King and Crane. He sent them to Damascus, to Beirut, Jerusalem in 1919, and he told them, go find out what the population there actually wants to be governed by. And the British and the French ensured that the report was suppressed. So the boundaries, the region is still arguing about today, in 2026, were drawn against the wishes of the people who had to live inside them. And the bill for that disregard, that's been fallen due in installments every decade since. And whatever comes out of the room in Islamabad has to honor the lesson we refused to honor all the way back in 1920. So this has been going on not just for 40 years, it's been going on for 100 years. And if we don't go back and work something out with the people that live there, it's going to fail to bring peace, just like it has time and time again. Episode 10's thesis, that's the rule. It's not the tool, it's the hand. Strikes are tools, ceasefires are tools, treaties are tools, mediators are tools used by hands that know what the F they're doing and know what they're actually trying to build. They do it with the people that they want to do it to, right? The people that live there. They can produce 20 years of relative quiet by doing that. Or if it's used, these tools are used by hands that don't know what they're doing, or they don't want to work with the people that live there and they just want to bully those people into submission, those hands are going to produce the next war. Marisol, I hope your son comes home. Baran, I hope you reach your mother this week. And Walter, for what it's worth, the geography's different, the regime targets are different, the credibility cost is different, and whether we're different is the question that hasn't yet been answered, and I hope we are. That's the show. Companion news script on the site. 3 stories on the Istanbul talks and on the Kiev attacks, the Yemen and prisoner swap, and the Trump Z Summit. Real reporting. They're on the site. analogscott.substack.com. You can find the show at loopta.com. Spell it out, LOOPTAH.com. And subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, Instagram. Talk to Machines, all one word. And ask for the machine question. Substack for the deeper reads. And we put notes up, and we're putting together pattern files as well that hopefully other content creators can use to create their own content about some of these topics these days. Until next time, I'm Analog Scott. That was The Machine. Confidence is provisional. Verification is mandatory. Build the architecture of consent. Don't waste the room.